You're skeptical of the state. You're getting over the myth of authority.
But the state is still formidable. Or is it?
You've got a front row seat in the transition to a free society.
Let's dive headfirst into
The White Pill Box with your host, Mark Maresca.
Greetings all. Thank you so much for joining today. Today, my guest on the show is Keith Knight himself. Keith, welcome to The White Pill Box.
Mark, thanks so much for having me.
Folks, Keith is managing editor at the Libertarian Institute and host of the Don't Tread on Anyone podcast. I will have links to his content as well as Keith's books, The Voluntarist Handbook and Domestic Imperialism. Keith, I've followed you for a while, but it's not often we hear about your backstory. Could you take us on a short trip through your journey from normie to getting red-pilled?
Yeah, it's so difficult to find an exact starting spot. I would have to say, originally looking into the concept of politics, I thought it was pretty clear. There is one group of people who wants to help you and give you stuff for free, care about the poor, and there's another group who's against them. So I think it's pretty clear that this is the evil group, the conservative, the right wing, the small government people, and then there's the good group. So I can't believe we're even having large-scale discussions about this. It's so simple. And then the discussion about what is called hilariously the Affordable Care Act, also known as Obamacare, there was a debate revolving around the individual mandate. So this would be the federal government requiring you to purchase a product or service, in this case health insurance, whether or not you wanted to buy it. So the immediate fallacy that we see is referred to as the, it goes by a few names, but it's a static assumption. So the assumption is we have products on the market now. Once you're forced to buy them, it'll be no different. Besides, you being forced to buy it, you'll still have those products in the future. What that mentality ignores is once the producers no longer have the incentive to please the customer through the mutually beneficial voluntary exchange aspect, the producers are likely to increase the price and lower the quality of service because they know that you don't have the option to exit and withdraw your scarce resources from funding their organization. So being introduced to a number of fallacies that helped me see through these things, I thought was pretty important, and it all revolved around this individual mandate. The conservatives at the time said, why should you be forced to buy something against your will, even if it's something that's objectively beneficial? Eating meat and vegetables instead of cake and ice cream. It's so obvious which one you should and should not be eating. It's so obvious you should walk instead of being a couch potato. But the question is, should the state have the right to force you against your will? A lot of people could be more productive if they were, frankly, enslaved. And sometimes a lot of them would be happier once you got them out of the house doing stuff instead of doom scrolling. Does that justify forcing someone to do something against their will, even if it's going to make them better off in the short run or the long run? And when I was thinking about this, I said, you know what? The question is, who owns the person in question? Do people own themselves, or does the community own them? But that wasn't even what was at stake here. The question was whether or not a subset of Americans in Washington, D.C. own the time, bodies, and scarce resources of everyone else in the entire nation. So I started looking at things through that lens, having been introduced to the works of Murray Rothbard and Ludwig von Mises. Probably came across, how did I come across them? Okay, so one last thing on the ACA. I just took that principle that conservatives had, why should you be forced to buy something, whether or not you want it, and I extended it to Social Security, and then Medicare, and then Medicaid, and anything else that the state coercively requires that you chip in for. And eventually I said, well, either they have the right to force you or they don't. If they have the right to force you on these things, why not everything else? And eventually I just said, instead of having double standards, only the state can initiate aggression to get the money they want, no one else can. I just took the principle of voluntarism and extended it consistently. Seeing Ron Paul in 2012, he was being interviewed, but I think it was before one of the presidential debates. He had been asked, you're worldview is very different than almost anyone else's on the stage. What is a book that you would recommend to people? And he recommended Frederick Bastiat's The Law. And I know I have a copy of it somewhere, but there was a line in there about the concept of consent of the government that Bastiat talks about. And the whole thing is, if we as a society see the state as an extension of ourselves, we could maybe delegate rights to them in the same way I delegate rights to the plumber I hire to come into my house. He doesn't get to live here permanently and have access to my bank account, but I create some sort of easement, not to anyone else's house, but a house that I rightfully own, I extend to this person through a voluntary contract. Well, if the average person does not have the right to issue taxes or issue regulations or monopolize a currency or conscript someone or regulate commercial interactions between consenting adults, if we don't have that right, how could we delegate that right to a group of people? Now, this gets to the heart of one of the fallacies of the government is an extension of the people, they represent the people. That is just monumental in the sense of it takes away one of the great propaganda levers. Now, if you want to say, no, the state has a monopoly on rights that no one else has, and it's beneficial for reasons A, B, and C, totally different conversation. We could do a cost-benefit analysis of that. But it was so weird that so many people in such high positions of power and influence would just say, well, the government is the people. They're an extension of us, without having thought of something so critical that Bastiat was talking about in France in 1850. And then Larkin Rose wrote a book, The Most Dangerous Superstition, which really updates a lot of the communication methods that Bastiat focused on. So that was how I got into this. That was my initial introduction. I was really curious about some of the, what you could call lifeboat scenarios. So the lifeboat scenario is we're on a lifeboat and there's unfortunately a leak, and I'm trying to pail the water out, and the other person in the lifeboat just says, you know what, I'm actually suicidal, so I'm not going to do anything. I'm just going to let the boat sink. Is it okay to coerce or threaten that person with stuff you'll do back on land once you survive? It's one of the ridiculous examples people use to justify any amount of aggression in the present is they use a hypothetical event that will never happen. Could you enslave a person against their will if it meant saving your own lives? I said, well, are there any real examples of lifeboat scenarios? And I said, well, maybe something like the war in Afghanistan, which we had just had 9/11. That was a necessary war, but Iraq was the mistake. And then I came across Scott Horton's book. This would have been in 2017. Titled Fool's Errand: Time to End the War in Afghanistan. And he makes the case that the war in Afghanistan was not some necessary war that we had to fight for either the preservation of our well-being, nor was it the case that Al-Qaeda and or the Taliban, two separate groups, were going to conquer America, but it turned out to be a war of choice. And I thought his case was very persuasive. Initially, he says, far from hating us for our freedom, which President Bush told the nation was the cause of the war. He said this would have been September 20th of 2001, right after the attacks. He said something to the extent of, Americans are asking why they hate us. They hate what they see in this chamber here, an elected government. Their leaders are self-appointed. They hate our freedom to vote and our freedom to disagree with each other. He says something to that extent. And it's just amazing that people at the time in high position, it's bad enough the average person fell for that, but people who consider themselves informed fell for such nonsense. So Scott makes a very plausible case in his book, Fool's Errand, that the claims of Osama bin Laden in his declarations of war are things that almost anyone else, you don't have to be a jihadist to sympathize with this. All you have to do is say, well, if some other country did this to us, how would we feel? Because remember, if there's a hypothetical where China might blockade Taiwan, we have to go to war with a nuclear power. But take some of the examples that bin Laden mentions, which would be the American support for Israel after Israel's invasion of southern Lebanon, murdering a number of women and children at a UN shelter in Qana, referred to as the Qana Massacre of 96. Or the practice of bombing Iraq throughout the 90s after sanctioning Iraq. You could see that this is something that almost anyone could sympathize with, or even the concept of allying with the king of Saudi Arabia, King Fahd, to station U.S. troops in Mecca and Medina. the American people, almost half of them, half of the voters, thought that Russia had quite literally taken over America in 2016 and installed President Trump and took away our freedoms. So if you think, well, what if Putin had worked with Trump to put Russian bases throughout America? Would we say, well, consent of the governed? We would see Trump as conspiring against us with Putin, and that's how bin Laden saw the situation in Saudi Arabia. So when Scott Horton listed the actual causes, very likely explanations, you realize that these were not unforeseeable events that radical Muslims imposed on us. It was actually blowback as a cause result of the socialist interventionist foreign policy that we are subjected to. Those were the things that got me interested. That's how Scott and I ended up meeting each other, was me researching that book and reaching out to him.
Wow, that's awesome. That kind of connects to what I was going to ask you also in terms of your own motivation. Now, you put a lot of effort in the freedom space, and that doesn't happen without being passionate about it. So I'd love if you could share a few notes, perhaps specifically about what about these ideas gives you that drive.
You know, I would say if I had to take a snapshot, there is something referred to by a gentleman named Mark Perry as the most important graph in the world. And the graph displays a number of products and services over time, and it refers to their price. You see a number of things that have gone down in price, such as televisions, computers, microphones, furniture, clothing. And you see a number of things that have increased in price: healthcare, housing, and what is referred to as education, but is state schooling. A lot of those things have gone up in price. And you realize that the correlation is that the state heavily regulates and heavily subsidizes the things that have gone up in price, and the things that are less regulated, that have more competition, that have more rights to contract, that have more free trade, those things have gone down in price. When you see how state regulation, in its attempt to regulate who people can interact with, at what quality of standards, at what prices, for what reasons, you see how this creates a number of barriers between producers and consumers. And the more barriers there are, the fewer options you have to access to goods and services in a certain industry. So essentially what happens is people end up working many more hours of their scarce time on Earth to access products and services that they otherwise would have had to work fewer hours to have access to. That's more time they could spend with their family, more time relaxing, more time doing things that they enjoy. So because the state, through this regulatory capacity, lowers the standard of living, makes the standard of living lower than it otherwise would have been, because it restricts the number of opportunities we have to make trades with people. It restricts the human capacity to cooperate and leads to all these detrimental things, primarily healthcare and housing being just outrageously expensive, not to mention the number of people that get murdered in wars based on lies. When you see how unnecessary this is, and you see that there is an alternative, which is the voluntary sector, where people can contract and homestead property and freely exchange in order to achieve their ends. When you see how detrimental this, I don't know if you'd call it a myth, Larkin Rose calls it the superstition, that once people buy into the concept of legitimate authority, all of these terrible dominoes follow afterwards, such as the regulatory state, the warfare state, the central bank, the caging people for victimless crimes and whatnot. Once you see the terrible effects and you see that there's a principle underlying so much of this, I think that's what initially motivated me.
And that ties to a lot of what I've noticed a lot of people experience, is that they understand, they are first exposed, perhaps, like in your case, it was the ACA, they're exposed to specific examples of how empirically you can see that the state interferes with human flourishing. But it really triggers a moral sensibility in us, an intuitive sense that it's not fair, because we do all feel ultimately that we own ourselves, and we don't like being interfered with. And when we simply extend that consistently, as you said, across the board, we realize it's the state that's violating this, and that's astoundingly unfair. And that only buttresses the idea that you really shouldn't have a state, because that's a moral offense, so to speak. So I do see this consistency. This ties a little bit to an odd question I had. It's not odd to me, but I'd love to ask you this. Now, I go back to the earliest of ANCAP generations almost. I go back to the 70s. And you'll often hear these anecdotes about how you could probably count all the libertarians that existed on one hand, that kind of thing, which is, of course, not true. There were many more than that, but it felt like that. The general attitude of that generation at that time, we were enthusiastic, we were confident in the ideas and all that, but there was sort of a muted sensibility about it, as if we sensed this is an enormous uphill struggle. We have no idea how these ideas are ever going to crack through at all. Today's youth, yourself included, I sense a difference. And I'll put it this way, even though it may not be totally accurate, it's almost as if you guys have a sense that, it's a done deal. This is happening. Statism is doomed. Eventually there'll be free societies. We don't necessarily know when or how, but it's happening. Am I interpreting enthusiasm, or do you actually sense that it's kind of going to be a done deal at some point?
I sense that it's absolutely going to be a done deal. Now, one of the things that I disagree with people on is I think they think, from how it's communicated to me, that as the ideas spread, the government's going to get smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller, and then there will be like victory day for anarcho-capitalism, and people will identify as such. I think it will be such a gradual process. It will occur. We'll never get credit for helping it move along. People will call it something totally different, and they won't even know what they're experiencing. The best reason that I have to believe this is so many people will credit capitalism with bad things that are actually the result of socialism, and say that socialism has done great things for us, but they're actually the result of the voluntary sector or the private property ethic. So it's very difficult for the average person to draw a correlation and say, well, I've noticed a lot of negative things coming out of the state's capacity to coerce, so I'm going to start embracing more and more anarcho-capitalism, and we should all do this, and then that'll usher in a different society. I think the state will just get so inefficient that there will be technological, or it wouldn't even have to be technological, differences that allow people to separate themselves and create alternatives. People, I believe, will get so fed up that they'll just start moving to alternatives, and those alternatives will be much more beneficial. One example you could see this in is, for how many years Walter Williams wrote Race and Economics, I want to say in like 2008, and just has like this devastating case against taxi cab medallions, which I don't think he ever necessarily won that. But what happened was Uber and Lyft came onto the scene, and the taxi cab medallions just became irrelevant. And it was so gradual, people never even said, hey, let's give credit to Walter Williams and Thomas Sowell and Milton Friedman for the ideas, because Uber and Lyft and Waymo prove that they were right and other people were wrong. It just became more efficient, so people switched. If we consider the state providing the core concept of protection of private property, of course, this is the great contradiction of the state. It's an expropriating property protector. If we consider the concept of property protection, including the protection of your own life, well-being, and independence, as a service, we can see the voluntary sector already providing many more aspects of security than the state could. And it's not like people have credited anarcho-capitalism or the free market with any of these ideas. So, for example, the thing that stops your bank account from getting hacked, or your digital property from being confiscated, one way to look at it is, well, there is a law that the state has, and they will punish someone if they're caught doing such a thing. But the likelihood of them catching someone is so slim. Also, people in many other countries, hundreds of millions of people have access to the same internet, which could hack your digital accounts, your banking account being the primary example. So what is it that really keeps your account safe? If someone in, what are there, like 1 billion or so people in China and Indonesia and India and Russia, are all those people terrified the US government will come after them if they hack my bank account? What actually happens is these firms have an incentive to stop that from happening in the first place, so they have a huge, complex network of privately developed security to protect your property. So when it comes to anything, the password to get into your email, the password to get access to your bank, multi-factor authentication, where you first have to get a text message to a second device. You have passcodes and keys, which allow you to access information from different devices if one fails. There is a whole big network of private security that's developed. And a lot of these companies, I haven't seen any of them, try to brag about the concept of anarcho-capitalism, but it's just so obviously inherently in their interest to say, hey, spend your scarce resources with us. They will be protected. And they now compete about how much they're going to protect your property and security. I think it'll be just the same way with any other piece of property, any other aspects such as your personal well-being. I think private companies will eventually fill the void, and the amount of competition, the amount of options that people will have will begin to increase. I don't know if it will start in America or Argentina, but either way, the concept of the expropriating property protector, I don't see that. I really don't see that lasting indefinitely, especially when there's access to so many ideas.
Yeah, I'm really glad you took it there. That whole idea of how the various aspects of technology and that evolution will emerge more and more options that simply will make the state irrelevant is very insightful. I want to now explore the contemporary world a little bit and see if we can pull out of that some maybe empirical evidence that we're headed that way. So I want to get your perspective now on this fascinating topic of the status of propaganda today. We are now in a new media landscape. I've heard very few of our fellow travelers really cover this, but Dave Smith is one of those few. And my own podcast here, I've highly focused on this for a while now because I believe the implications are profound. Propaganda is a fundamental pillar of statism. It's utterly foundational. A population will not long remain fully indoctrinated in the superstition of political authority if propaganda's effectiveness erodes. So I'd love your initial thoughts before we dig into this more about what you think the second order implications of eroding propaganda might mean, assuming you agree it is eroding.
Yes, I do think it's eroding. The best example might be the recent war of aggression against Iran that the Trump administration launched. I have never seen such a lack of support for almost any government operation, whether it's domestic or foreign, especially at such an early point, especially among the supporters of the current executive regime. So when you look at the big players, of course, Dave Smith, who had voted for Trump, had called for Trump's impeachment back in June of 2025 during the 12-day war. So we lost a little support there. Rogan is not as passionate about Trump as he previously was. Tucker Carlson and Candace Owens and Megyn Kelly have all withdrawn their support and become very critical of the president. I cannot imagine this happening 10 or so years ago when those guys only could have been at Fox. Candace would have been at Fox or Prager University. And if she came out with this stuff at Prager University, where she was before the Daily Wire, she would have been let go, and she might have been handing out pamphlets, or it wouldn't have been profitable for her to hand out pamphlets. She probably would have done something else, maybe been an actress. So because of the large amount of competition that the free market has provided on social media, you have competing ideas which have allowed people to at least get some semblance of the truth. It is just so obvious that the guy who pulled America out of the Iran deal, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, this would have been Obama's 2015 project, which limited Iran's nuclear capacity to 3.67% in their nuclear development. And we have that same guy saying they were enriching up to 60%, and once you're at 60, you can get to 90, and then you basically have a nuke. The fact that it's the same guy who tore up the same agreement saying Iran cannot get a nuclear weapon, it's just so easy to see through that when it's readily available and produced again and again and again by accounts on X and Facebook and Odyssey.com and YouTube and Rumble, it's just to the point where it really loses its sting. Because previously it was, there are large-scale discussions happening, there's a lot of classified documents, and the president has to keep those under wraps, and I'm sure there's something there. Now people can totally see through that because people like Tucker Carlson and Candace Owens have given the green light. I can see how in the past you might think, well, Watergate hurt Nixon's credibility. How is Trump's credibility hurting him going to affect the state overall? There's something so different about this with Tucker Candace and Megyn Kelly and Dave Smith passionately opposing President Trump. It would be the equivalent of Bill O'Reilly and Sean Hannity coming out in opposition to George Bush's war in Iraq and saying we can't support the president over this. It's just absolutely wild. So one part is the competing narratives, I think, have been able to win out. It's not that the truth always wins out. It's that if there's a small chance the truth can prevail, you have more of an opportunity for people to see through propaganda. You also don't see that great of an effort on behalf of the propagandists to really sell this to us. It's so pathetic. I literally feel like if the White House hired me, I could do a better job. What I would have said immediately, if I were Stephen Miller, is I would have said, look, there was a Second World War where a lot of innocent people died. It would have been great if we could have just taken out Hitler and stopped the whole thing. And that's what we did with this recent operation. We killed the Ayatollah and his top 50 guys in the first couple days. So now we're going home and declaring victory. And then they could have gotten back into something. They wouldn't have called it the JCPOA, but it would have been the same thing that the Iranians would have agreed to. And they could have declared this a victory. Now, of course, there's terrible consequences from that, which is it would give the regime the same amount of confidence they had after Venezuela and say, well, let's do it again in Greenland. Well, maybe we should be looking at Beijing to see if we could get regime change there. So I can see how this could be detrimental. But the lesson is that the propaganda is so weak that they almost, I don't know if they're completely out of options, but the people that they promote, the president explicitly tells people to watch the Mark Levin show, something so pathetic. And we should have been able to foresee this. If you look at the average debate on YouTube, it's way more interesting than any of the presidential debates I've ever watched. Even if you look at Robert Kennedy debating Governor of California, Ronald Reagan, in 1967, I want to say this was. That was a little more interesting, but it's nothing compared to any of the debates you could find on Zero Hedge. So because the intellectual quality is so much higher in the voluntary sector, where people don't have access to trillions of dollars in coercive funds, people actually try harder. They come with more evidence. And I think that's how the propagandists can be outcompeted. So yes, I do see that the propaganda is waning against the psychopath class.
And it's not even limited necessarily to just getting an alternate view, which itself is a wonderful thing to take some of the wind out of the sails of propaganda. But it's also the fact, and you sort of touched on this before, that technologically, and especially with the internet maturing, there is so much for normal people to do. There is so much they can do in terms of time spent and not necessarily attending or giving their attention to current events, but doing projects or sewing videos or auto repair or whatever it is. These options have expanded so much that they are necessarily crowding out the ability of propaganda to be effective. So while the state is most certainly going, and the media, traditional media, is going to continue to attempt to propagandize, I almost metaphorically look at it as a single senator standing on the steps of a Capitol building all alone, yelling out the classic propaganda of vague generalities, but not as many people are listening. And if you don't, or if you're not in a position necessarily to be listening as much, you can't get propagandized as much. And that to me is one of the wonderful things about how propaganda does seem to be losing its efficacy. I think COVID is a very interesting example of this, where at the beginning, most of us ANCAPs were very discouraged about the public response to it, meaning they just went for it hook, line, and sinker. What I find more interesting is that about 1.5 years or 2 years into it, it basically fizzled. For me, I don't actually remember the government declaring COVID Victory Day and that being a national holiday right now. That didn't happen. I don't remember the parades of declaring COVID victory. Why? If they had conquered a worldwide threat to humanity, you would think they'd pat themselves on the back. No, it fizzled. Why? Because I think by that point, the internet had matured enough to where the decentralization of information flow had truly taken some of the wind out of the sails of propaganda, and it wasn't able to be maintained. Is that consistent with any of your observations?
Yeah, that is a very good point to look at the other side of the equation. And you can measure this by looking at the White House views on YouTube and compare them to anything that Dave Smith or Joe Rogan or Tucker Carlson gets whenever they make a video. So even though the Mark Levins and the Donald Trumps are on televisions at tons of gyms, tons of bars, tons of airports, they can still not only be seen by more people, the number of people who actually see it, it's very hard to measure both sides of that equation because there's so many short videos on X from different channels and everything. The number of people who actually embrace the propaganda and believe it long term, there's a very short time horizon, and it gets switched so frequently. Of course, the Trump supporters almost completely forget that he was totally in favor of lockdowns, even though he said that they would be shorter. He would brag about Operation Warp Speed, developing the vaccine. According to their estimates, almost all the people who didn't get the vaccine should be dead from COVID. So how did they explain that? It just became a racket that they couldn't really maintain. They can scare you and scare you and scare you, probably the same way my grandma was terrified of marijuana, turning people into violent psychopaths and making them lead degenerate lives. And then you're like, well, nowadays I know a lot of people who use it, and even though I don't like it, it's not as bad as they said it was. So the propaganda just lost its sting. So what they have to do is they have to jump to a next issue to scare you. Al-Qaeda's going to get you. Well, Saddam's going to drop a nuke on you. Well, Assad is gassing his own people, and this is terrible, and we got to go save them. The North Koreans might be invading Guam. That was a big one. Putin might take over Ukraine, then Europe, then America. Xi Jinping, we're told, will first take over Taiwan and then take over America because Chinese company partially owns TikTok. They have to keep coming up with these new things. And I think people are just losing interest. It's so hard to keep up with. And the psychopath class doesn't seem to have too much energy as they're promoting these things. I mean, look at the example I used in a speech recently was Trump being asked by Lindsay Davis, the debate moderator in, I guess, would have been October of 2024, where Trump and Kamala were debating. She asks him, so you've been running for president for 9 years. What is your health care plan? Considering, health care is a issue that a lot of Americans face with these outrageous bills and low quality, and the government giving us the food pyramid with the USDA. And Trump said, well, I have concepts of a plan, and you'll be hearing about it shortly, but we would only replace it if we could replace it with something better. But you'll be hearing about it in the not too distant future. It was something so pathetic. Like, how did he not have 3 bullet points to at least lie to us about? And I think they're really losing the amount of energy. I mean, if you take the type of personality that it takes to become a George Washington versus the type of personality it takes to become a George Bush, the George Bush personality is much more being assisted along the way. Dad went to Yale. He got into Yale. He got access to the Rangers. He became governor of Texas. There's not a lot of risk. So a very passionate person could easily get through that system and get to the highest level. Whereas the George Washington personality is real passionate, willing to take tons of risk, and really communicate the ideas. So because the state has become such a honeypot and there's such a revolving door, the type of personality who's able to become successful in this realm of politics today is someone who most likely is not going to be very impressive. And the vice presidents, of course, are the biggest examples of it. They're just so unimpressive all around. So I think the system, they're getting lazy because they don't have an incentive to be passionate and really communicate to the masses. I think that is going to be their downfall, essentially.
Okay, so we're going to take that, and now we're going to zoom up to the 30,000-foot level, and I'm going to ask you something that I'm very interested in hearing your take on. Okay, let's talk about 2 fundamental causal dynamics here. One is propaganda and what it means to the myth of political authority. Now, I consider it a fundamental driver of it. In other words, you really can't maintain a ubiquitous population-wide belief in political authority unless propaganda is relentless and continuous. And the reason I think that is because the myth of authority is false. It is not true that a certain group of elites have moral authority over the rest of us. So like any false belief, the only way it continues is if someone is somehow indoctrinated or made to believe it, like in a cult, for example. Except in the case of belief in authority, this happens to be a population-wide belief. So it takes relentless propaganda to sustain it. So causally, I see propaganda as the fundamental driver of the myth. So the question then is, if propaganda is eroding, which it seems to be based on what we've been saying and these examples we've given, and the fact that it seems quite sustainable. It's not like this is temporary. I don't think next week or next year people are going to go back to wanting to watch ABC at 8 o'clock at night on the nightly news anymore. I think we're headed. So I'm curious if you see that causal connection and if it portends further erosion of the myth of political authority.
Yeah, I could see. So if the argument is the way the state maintains the monopoly on violence is, one, through propaganda, and two, the amount of weapons they have access to and the threats. So even if you don't believe it, you're still going to abide by the regulations and chip in for the horrible wars, even though you yourself are not propagandized. But once the propaganda starts failing at a large enough scale, people's willingness to not buy in or even resist. All you need is a very small percentage of people to resist, and then it becomes unprofitable for the state to maintain the scam any longer. I could see that being the determining point, the profitability point. So as fewer and fewer people fall for the scam, that people who would have political personalities see it as more profitable to go into other industries. So let me think of if I could come up with an example. So one way that you could increase the amount of products and services you have access to is by invading a place, conquering it, ethnically cleansing it, and setting up your own territory. However, that is extremely costly and risky, and you might have to conscript a lot of people to do it. So if you really want more wealth, it might not be, in the modern day, it might not be the Genghis Khan approach. It's probably more so the free trade approach. So the reason I think Donald Trump is not exactly as bad as he is, he's not Genghis Khan, where he explicitly is a man of conquest, he just lies about it. But the vast majority of power they get comes from being able to be parasites off a population that is very productive. Not because because Trump is so much better than Genghis Khan, it's because it's just not profitable to engage in such a thing any longer. Or rather, most politicians see it as more profitable to just be parasites on their domestic population than it would be to conquer other lands. I think at the height of American slavery, 1% of Americans were slave owners, even though, of course, the whole country gets grilled for something 1% of people engaged in. I think there's a lot of psychos or people who are just indifferent in the present. So we might think that there's a bunch of people who are enslaved today working on plantations against their will. The reality is it was no longer profitable for people to engage in such an activity where owning someone, housing them, making sure they didn't run away, that's very costly. It just became more profitable for them to engage in investments or trade to increase their standard of living. So I think the political class will eventually see that it's less profitable over time. And the reason they're going to see that it's slowly less profitable is because fewer and fewer people are falling for the propaganda. That very well could be an explanation. I hope that gets to the heart of the question you were asking.
You took this exactly where I was hoping you would. Now we're going to do a connection here. You mentioned the agents of the state, let's say the politicians, I think is who you were focused on. And you mentioned their incentives in acting. And so what you're really saying is, correct me if I'm wrong, is they are praxeological actors. Isn't that interesting? This dispels one of the easy assumptions I think it's very easy, even for libertarians to make, which namely would be, the state, yeah, that's the empire in Star Wars. They're a fleet of innumerable stormtroopers led by evil overlords that have unlimited resources and power. Now, I realize people don't actually say that the state that we have is like Star Wars, but you almost get an impression that in response to any given problem, the state has unlimited resources or will act in an unlimited way. I had a conversation with a friend very recently about school shootings or mass shootings. And this is a blue pill person. And one of their responses is, well, what we really need is to have metal detectors at every venue, everywhere in the United States. Any place people could gather where there's, say, 10 or more people, you just need a metal detector. And I said, you mean every church, every business, every apartment house? Yes, everywhere. So now you can see how, and we're the ones accused of being utopian. You can see how there's no sense of, resource constraints or even praxeology here. There's simply, they'll just do that if they want. No, the state actually works within constraints, and the particular human beings who occupy these positions of authority themselves act within constraints. My point being that if you narrow down the people who really count in the state, the politicians, and I would also say law enforcers, are the two big groups that really comprise what I call the bullies of the state. And by the way, there's only about 3 million of them in the United States. Everyone else is support, IT, HR, you name it. And they really don't count for the myth of authority. We don't defer our moral authority as blue-pilled people to the DMV clerk or the IT guy over at the county. No, it's the politicians and the law enforcers. They themselves are praxeological actors, and as such, they have to deal with the environment at hand. And I think you hit on a good point that as time passes, their own choices are going to change as the environment of a more skeptical population, a more skeptical sense in the world about statism or law enforcement will simply draw them away to other options that they actually have in the world, like Walmart greeter or bank security guard or spouse of a rich person. All these are options they have, but they choose the state today because the totality of incentives happen to line up in their subjective perspective as being most attractive. But as time is passing, I think we're going to see simply a diminution in that. What are your thoughts about that?
I think that's totally reasonable because I think a lot of people might think that we're going to change the ideas of the population, and you have this vision of the people rising up and demanding change, and then like Ceausescu in Romania, he just steps down and runs away, and he's so terrified. I think it'll be much more gradual. People will see the writing on the walls. They'll respond to the incentives of, I don't want to call it the consumer base because that would equate the voluntary sector with the coercive sector, but the domestic population. In the same way, if you look at a lot of tweets from maybe 2016, a lot of the politicians will be talking about, they'll be promoting race Marxism or cultural Marxism, the attempt to divide a society and justify a very big state because of differences between groups, races, and genders. That is not as popular as it was 10 years ago. Now, maybe it's because Thomas Sowell convinced all them that they're wrong. That would be lovely. I don't think that's what happened. But I think eventually people just saw through the propaganda, and the politicians no longer saw it as profitable to focus on the police killing between 13 and 17 unarmed blacks a year. This was called to our attention as the great injustice, which in those cases it totally was. The problem was there were a number of unarmed whites actually who were also killed, and there were a greater disproportionate amount of men killed to women. But once you see it through that, you say, well, the men are probably killed much more often than women because men tend to be more violent, and Asians probably have higher incomes than whites, not because we're an Asian supremacist society, but because they probably have a different cultural ethic, and they have tiger parents and everything in their culture. So eventually it just faded and faded and faded away, and there was no victory day. Just like COVID, it's like, oh, this is getting pathetic, quick switch to something else. I think the victory day will be when we gradually notice the switching from the political class achieving resources coercively and slowly getting more and more into the voluntary sector. I think that's totally reasonable.
And it's happening to some extent now. There are experiments out there. There's free cities that are, Morrison and Prospera are all examples. And of course, they're not ANCAP by any means, but they are experiments in self-governance. And the longer they go on, at least the ones established, the more entrepreneurs will observe that and see profit opportunities and attempt even more such experiments. It would seem, even though I would say if you're looking at a curve, we're at the very beginning of that curve, nonetheless, all these exponential type curves, they sharpen up very quickly once you reach these general tipping points. I agree with you. We won't know that we're in that tipping point when it occurs. It's all gradual and emergent. Nonetheless, there certainly is a point at which it puts the lie. When I say puts the lie, I mean these free city type experiments, parallel institutions to the state, parallel currencies. There's a point where it puts the lie to the idea that without the state, we descend into Mad Max chaos, because you'll have places like Prospera or Morrison who have been around by that time, let's say 15 years, 20 years. Okay, well, where's the cannibalism you were predicting? And suddenly we're able to make the empirical argument, whereas before it was strictly the theoretical argument, that they don't descend into chaos. Now, as people see it for themselves, oh, look, they're getting along without the state, or at least with much state. That's when I believe we will see an acceleration, because success builds on success, so to speak. What are your thoughts?
Yes, success building on success. That makes total sense. I remember Ed Stringham wrote a book. I believe it's titled Private Governance, but he published another one where he discussed, it's called Anarchy in the Law. And he talks about Gustave de Molinari's concept of, monopolies are bad. They give you less choice. They produce lower quality at a higher price. What is so different about the state producing clothes than the state providing security? So we talked about this interesting concept. Shouldn't there be competition in security and protection of property for the same reason there should be competition in everything else? And Ed Stringham gives the point that there's so many things in our modern day, PayPal, Venmo, and then the earlier examples I used of bank accounts, access to YouTube accounts. Those are vitally important aspects of people's everyday life, and we completely rely on private security for that. I used to work at an IT firm, and one of our clients got ransomware. All of their files were completely encrypted, and I think that the hackers were asking something like 6 figures for it. And the company called us and said, hey, is there anything we can do about this? And we basically said, yeah, just completely ignore it. We have all your stuff backed up. And we charged a very small fee, much less than the state would provide, much less than the state would ask as their monthly tax to maybe protect some of your files. We were like, yeah, but we have everything protected. Just completely ignore them. You guys are going to get different devices. We could wipe these clean. And one of the things I ask people is, did you call the police on these people? I believe they were from Indonesia or India. And the woman at the front desk said, I think my boss said something that he might pursue this. I'm not sure. It didn't even occur to them that when their most sacred information, their entire business model was at stake, didn't even occur to them to call the police. They're like, well, no, I would call the private company who we've contracted with. I don't think any of them knew who Hans Hoppe was or Murray Rothbard, but it was just in their incentive. So this would be a case where it's not just some technicality of, if I want to hypothetically protect a rock, I could put it in a safe. We're talking about the most important property that people have. They trust with the voluntary sector, and it doesn't even occur to them to say, hey, 911, yeah, we have ransomware, so send NATO to Indonesia, go find the guys, maybe blow up the data center. It's also costly and also ridiculous that the private market just had a better incentive to avoid something like that happening in the first place. And when it did happen, we had the incentive to have backups. Nothing the state would ever have an incentive to provide for their involuntary customer base. So, yeah, I'm glad this is a pretty optimistic conversation. I'm glad I did this.
Well, the title of the show is The White Pill Box, and sometimes I have to clarify that, by the way. I've noticed that sometimes the comments I'll get is that, It's so great that you're an optimistic person. It's so great that you look at the glass half full. And I cringe a little bit because that's not at all how it works. I use the analogy of a parent in a waiting room, and their little child has succumbed to some kind of unknown virus or disease, and they're super worried, and they're waiting, and they're it's awful, very blackpilling. And their friend comes along and puts their arm around her and say, "Don't worry, everything's going to be great." Okay? And you look at them and you say, your heart's in the right place. I know that, but really, that's cold comfort right now because I don't have a reason to feel better. Next thing that happens is the doctor comes in and says, "Great news. Your child's immune system has kicked in. He's going to be okay. He's not out of the woods, but he's going to be okay." And you say to the doctor, "Well, doctor, I appreciate your positive attitude, but really it gives me cold comfort because I have no reason to believe you." And the doctor would be like, "Oh, no, wait, you don't understand. I want you to be optimistic, not because I want you to look at the glass half full, but because here's empirical evidence to make you think that way." I strive very hard on my podcast to make sure that when I'm talking about white pills, I am talking about empirical, provable, or at least to the extent we can prove why there's a reason for optimism. For example, we mentioned praxeology. It's not often that libertarians look at the state actors, politicians and law enforcement, as praxeological actors. But once you do that, you realize that, yes, they, as propaganda does erode, which means as the myth of authority tends to erode, they're in an environment that's very different than 50 years ago when people just stood up and saluted the flag and taught their kids to make sure they obey Officer O'Malley over there. This isn't a world we live in, which means that's not the environment that those very praxeological state bullies operate in. So they themselves can, over time, be making other options. It's boring, but it's one of the ways the state erodes is simply by its main players, the people who are subject to the myth of authority, or objects of the myth of authority, kind of leave the scene. I'm not saying that's the only way it happens, but without as many people who are power seekers who are choosing the state, it is a little bit hard for the state to maintain itself. A great example of that is today's military and police recruiting statistics. Now, if you look those up on the surface, it looks like they are meeting their goals. Even when there's maybe a shortfall, eventually they'll meet their goals. I've drilled into this a little bit. As it turns out, the only reason they're meeting their goals is because most of the people joining are choosing admin or support type roles. When you look at the subset of military and police roles that are filled for people who must specifically carry a gun and risk confrontation with actual other human beings, that's the class that they are not meeting their goals for. That's praxeology at work. So there's a white pill for you right there.
No, very nice. Always glad to get empirical white pills, not just theoretical ones.
In your role as a managing editor of Libertarian Institute, I'd love to know what that entails. What kind of work do you put into that? What does it entail? I'd love to know.
I read a ton of books, and I try to extract lessons from those books and summarize them for a lay audience. So, for example, the one I'm doing right now, let me get this monster. This is Herbert Hoover's book, Freedom Betrayed. The full title is Herbert Hoover's Secret History of the Second World War and Its Aftermath. I've done a video or two on this one before, but there are so many lessons to extract that I keep going back. So I will read either a book and provide a summary in article or podcast format so the layperson can extract the most important lessons from those, or I will do things like these presidential autobiographies. For the watching audience, you can see behind me, we have George Washington right there. To Jefferson, we have presidential speeches, and they go all the way to President Obama. I try to either extract lessons from a certain president in their own words, or try to find common themes throughout the presidents and try to summarize those for the lay audience. I've been finding it's great to read Lincoln's speeches. So even though he never wrote an autobiography, I just have a collection of speeches when he was a congressman. I think he was a congressman as opposed to a senator. And some of his early speeches as president of America. So I like to go to primary sources, summarize research, and offer people the education I wish college would have given me. But they didn't, so I dropped out from 3 different colleges. So that's what it entails. Reading a bunch of research, summarizing it for a lay audience in podcast and article format, mainly relying on as many primary sources as I possibly can.
I was going to say that we should remind the audience that the Libertarian Institute can take donations at any time if you want to just plug that, because it's a great organization.
Absolutely. Libertarianinstitute.org/donate. If you like the concept of us building an actual alternative to the college system, I love the arguments against the education system, K through 12 plus college. You spend tons of time and tons of money and get so little bang for your buck that after college, it's really hard to find a job, and the thing you majored in might have been outcompeted, or there's different technologies and the degree is totally useless. So if you really want to support an alternative to state education, we're trying to make it freely available to anyone at libertarianinstitute.org, and you can get a free PDF of both of my books, Domestic Imperialism, 9 Reasons I Left Progressivism, and The Voluntarist Handbook.
Wonderful. And that is a great place to wrap things up because we are right at the hour. Folks, I encourage you to check out the show notes for Keith's content and to follow him. You will not be sorry. Keith, thank you so much for joining me today on the White Pill Box.
Of course. Thanks, Mark.
And as always, thanks so much to everyone out there as well. Take care and see you next time.
Thanks so much to all subscribers and everyone who joined today. And remember, keep looking for those white pills.